Okay.
Yeah.
So first question of how did you meet Ed Roberts?
Well, maybe I should start out by saying, how did I get in contact with him? Because in 61, I contracted polio. I grew up, and at that time I was still in Germany. And in the hospital, I spent 5 years in the hospital. Through the help of somebody, I got a hold of copies of the Toomey J cassette. The Toomey J cassette was edited by Ginny Laurie from Missouri. And she edited a newsletter, you could call it, once a year, more or less, with news around the world for people who had polio, who had the need of mechanical ventilation, like myself at that time. And so she was building a network. And I believe it was in the 1962 edition that Ginny portrayed several people who studied at the university in the US. And as a matter of fact, I almost got a hold and eventually met all of them. And one of them was Ed Roberts. And Ed was interesting because he was a little older than me, but he was studying in Berkeley, and Berkeley sounded interesting to me. I saw a small article with a picture of him, showing him and his brother Randy in the classroom. And at that time, I was desperately looking for solutions to get out of the hospital. And the only way to get out seemed to be through studying at the university. So I completed high school while still in the hospital, and I wrote letters to lots of different universities asking whether they could accept me, given my physical problems here, including the ventilator. And all of them in Germany said, no, no way, cannot take this responsibility. Our places are completely inaccessible to people using wheelchairs. We're talking about the year 1963-4. So I wrote Ed a letter asking him a little bit about the technical details, how he got into the university, whether there was a program, and how to apply for it, etc. And he did answer me, which in retrospect, knowing him, having gotten to know him later on, which in retrospect was quite unexpected that he would answer. Anyway, but he did answer me in saying that this program was sponsored by the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, which is only open to residents of California. And as a foreign student, I wouldn't be able to utilize that. But it did give me an idea what it might look like in the classroom and the wheelchair. So you might say that Ed was one of several, I think about 5, 6 students that made it to the university somewhere in the US, which inspired me and gave me a hope that with lots of luck, I might be able to get there too. that was when I got in contact with him. The first time I met him, that was the first time I was in Berkeley was 73 in May, the end of May. And the first time, but then when I was there, I was just there for a day, flew up from Los Angeles, and he was out of town. He was in Berkeley. Sorry, he was in Sacramento lobbying with some politicians, they told me. And the next time I was there, that was in, I had already moved to Sweden, and that year was 74, winter 74. That's when I met him. And he had promised me a place to stay, because I said I would be there a month. And first it didn't turn out that way, so he put me up in his house, the greenhouse, as it was called at that time, where he had a few very interesting tenants there. I could tell you long stories about that, but I spent a weekend there on his couch with Sam, the old dog, who was incontinent and was shitting on the floor. These very exciting times. And then I moved to, what's her name? Catherine Caulfield. I could sleep on her couch. So that's how I got by. And that's the way I got introduced into the community. And I was returned every time I had a chance to get back to the States, especially the West Coast, I would make a point of visiting Berkeley. Although I had lived 70 years and studied in Los Angeles, I got to like Berkeley a lot more. And that was because of the community. Okay.
So you touched on this a little, but I want to know, what role did Ed play in your life? What role did Ed play in your life, and how did he influence you?
Well, considering that I didn't live in the same city as he did, I mean, my contacts with Ed were sporadic. As I said, I was in Berkeley for weeks, and once I was there for a month or 3 months. I had with the World Institute of Disability awarded me a fellowship in '85 that allowed me to live and work in Berkeley. I was staying in Judy Human's house and had a workplace at WID. Got to meet cool people like Hale Sukas and Joan Leon and Simi Litwack, and of course, the incredible Judy Human. So Ed was one of the people who influenced me. I couldn't say really that he was a role model more than that he had been a role model to inspire me to believe it was possible for me to attend the university, given my disability. In that respect, he helped to influence my life because, university studies were very important to me. And my exposure to California, to a foreign university, to the US and to the movement there, was also very influential and formed my life, I must say. But it wasn't only Ed, as I said.
Describe your impressions of Ed. What was his personality like?
Well, Ed was, he was very verbal. He liked to talk. He had his way with words. He was charming. You might say he was charismatic. And inspiring. I can't believe that politicians or civil servants at the higher level that would fall for him. I can't believe that. And he had a way of getting along with, I suppose, most people at any level. You know, he could talk to people, the grassroots members, and to top politicians. He managed to catch their attention. And I saw him many times giving speaking presentations, or saw him in dialogue with top politicians, and that was always very impressive. He would speak freely, ad lib, apparently without notes. He had it always in his mind. And he would speak naturally. He wasn't sort of trying to speak academically. No, he spoke as if we were sitting around the kitchen table. And that, I think, grabbed people's attention, in contrast to lots of other people who approach this speaking engagements from an academic angle. And he was fun to be with. I mean, he would talk a lot. And sometimes I had a suspicion that not everything he said was based on, well, let's be brutal and say, based on facts. So he did have a tendency to sometimes use hot air. But it was not to fool you. It was meant to inspire you. Mm-hmm. Yep.
I guess, what wisdom did Ed pass on to you?
Well, you know, the word wisdom is an inflationary term. And I wouldn't use it in that context. I saw the question, but couldn't think of anything. It was his example, and that the insight or the conclusion I drew, observing him in action, that we don't have to be afraid approaching people in power and for the purpose of telling them what our life is about and why we have the self-evident right to inclusion and to participation at the same conditions as everybody else. I mean, his example demonstrated to me that it's all right to speak up, and they damn listen to us. And if we have our act together and do it right, they will listen to us. That was my conclusion. Yeah.
So what was Ed's legacy more broadly?
His what?
His legacy. What was his legacy more broadly?
His legacy. Well, he became the key figure of the movement. And I mean, of course, I've observed other people who also were influential in forming and organizing the movement. I mean, Ed was influential in getting himself and other people, like the Rolling Guards, out of the what's it called? The hospital wing on campus into the community. And he was influential in getting a grant from the federal government for setting up a program in the community. But he had other people. I mean, he had John Hessler. I met John Hessler. In fact, we became friends. I stayed in once a whole month in the apartment next to John's place, and got to see how John was operating and how Ed was operating. Ed obviously was the more charismatic person. He was the talker, the salesman, the convincer. So after he left the boardroom, then John would move in and hash out the details. So Ed would not have been able to do so much if he had not been helped by a lot of competent people. I mean, just think of the threesome of Ed, Joan Leon, and Julie Human, who founded together the World Institute of Disability. I mean, Ed was the talker, the visionary, you might call him, but the person who delivered the goods, that was John Leon. She was the backroom person. And it was obviously Judy Human. And Judy's contributions at the time when Ed was still alive, I think was often seen in the shadow of Ed. People needed the key figure, the icon. And they opted for Ed because he was the man. He was a little bit older. Maybe that was the reason, I'm not sure. But often Ed blocked the view of the people around him who were also instrumental in getting things done, who accomplishing change, social change. So the legacy would not have been possible without his ability to attract good people. Under his and Judy's leadership, a lot of people moved to Berkeley. I mean, as, for example, the documentary Clip Camp shows, lots of people who were Judy's friends at the East Coast before she left there. A lot of people there whom she knew joined her later on in Berkeley. They followed her. And people came from all over the country, and in some instances, even from all over the world, just like myself, at least temporary, to be there at the Mecca. Berkeley was our Mecca in those days.
I'm gonna go off script a little, just because you mentioned Judy, you mentioned Joan. How do we handle Ed being the icon or being the face of the movement? Was there any like resentment there that he was the guy in terms of who the icon, or did they not? Did they?
He was the guy, and him and both Joan and Judy liked him. So they were generous, and they knew they were great enough not to feel sort of secondary to him. They knew what they were worth, so they didn't have to feel put down or put in a secondary place. And Ed couldn't do everything by himself anyway. So he was very much dependent on the two of them, especially on Judy.
So you could say there's a lot of mutual respect there.
Excuse me?
You could say there's a lot of mutual respect there amongst the three of them.
Oh yeah.
That we respected each other enough that they each knew what. Each kind of had their roles, as it were.
That's right. Each had their role and knew very well about its strengths and weaknesses, and knew how to compensate that. So there was a great team. And as you can see, after Ed's death and after Judy's gone, the WIT didn't do so well afterwards. And I'd say that the WIT's role nowadays has very much decreased. I can only speak from the international point of view, not from the national, because I'm not close enough to observe WIT's national impact. But its international impact definitely has diminished.
You talked about you obviously being from Germany. You being from Germany now, I believe you're in Sweden. Am I right? What was Ed have the legacy overseas? Do people know about other than you? Do people know what he was trying to do?
Well, many people, like myself, who visited Berkeley and met Ed and the community, they went home back again and said, we got to start something similar. So I was involved in two efforts, one to introduce the independent living movement to Germany, and in particular, in my case, to introduce independent living movement to Sweden. And I know of other countries where people who had been to the States, been to Mecca, as I call it, tried to introduce the movement. And what would have been more natural than invite Ed himself and Judy, or both of them. So I met Judy in '82 in Munich. In fact, I translated her from English to German, and I invited both Ed and Judy to Sweden in 1983 for a 3-day conference, which then started the independent living movement in Sweden, I'd say. And I've been together with them, but mainly Judy, in many, many different places where we fulfilled the same role. That is, local people had invited us to talk about our angle perspective and our respective interests in the independent living movement. For example, in a few weeks, both Judy and I are scheduled to talk for a Turkish women's organization with women with disabilities. And the plan is that she would start out how the independent living movement started in the US. And I would then step in and talk about the principles of the ideology, how it changed around the world a little bit, and would speak mainly then about personal assistance as one of the core components of independent living movement. I mean, it's always the same again. It's deinstitutionalization through personal assistance and overcoming all the attitudinal and financial and architectural obstacles that are obstructing our way into the society. It's always the same. Hasn't changed a bit. It's still as necessary and timely as it used to be in the 70s and the 80s.
Wow, thank you.